The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of shoes on polished floors and the murmurs of the audience settling into their seats. It was a place where justice was dispensed, where important decisions were made that could change lives forever. But today, something was different. A moment that would haunt one of the attendees for years to come was about to unfold, something that no one saw coming. As the judge made his way to the bench, a woman stood by the door, waiting for the case to begin. She glanced around, looking for the right person, the one who would be leading the proceedings today. But instead of seeing a figure dressed in a black robe, she saw a man older, dressed simply in a janitor's uniform, with a broom in his hand and a stoic expression on his face. Without hesitation, she walked up to him, smiling as she asked, "Excuse me, sir, do you know where the judge is?" The man looked up, momentarily startled, then lowered his gaze back to the floor as he continued sweeping. He didn't speak, just nodded as if acknowledging her question but not quite understanding the urgency. She glanced at him, confused, and stepped back, wondering why this man, dressed in such humble attire, wasn't reacting to her question the way she had expected. It wasn't until the woman turned away, disappointed by the lack of response, that another member of the courtroom, observing from across the room, couldn't hold back a chuckle. He leaned toward her and said, "He's the judge." Her eyes widened. She turned back, but the man in the janitor's uniform hadn't moved. He continued with his work, seemingly unaware of the quiet attention he was drawing. Confusion was written across her face, as the realization began to settle in. The man she had mistaken for a janitor was not only the one she'd been seeking but someone who commanded the authority of a court of law. The woman took a slow, steady breath as her mind raced. How had she missed it? The way he carried himself, the calm authority that emanated from him despite his appearance. She quickly straightened up, ready to apologize, but before she could take another step, the doors to the courtroom slammed shut. Everyone turned their attention to the bench, and as the judge took his seat, his presence seemed to command the entire room. The energy shifted. The woman froze, her eyes now locked on him. The realization of her mistake and her embarrassment began to sink in. But what really took her by surprise was how the judge had handled the situation. He hadn't reacted in anger or even in a way that would shame her. Instead, he had simply let her make her assumption, quietly observing her every move. The courtroom was silent as the case began, and all eyes were on him. He spoke with a calm and steady voice, the kind that made you feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. His words held weight, each one measured carefully, like the slow turn of a dial. It was clear that he was a man who had earned his place, not through appearances, but through the sheer strength of his character. Yet, as the proceedings unfolded, there was an unspoken tension in the room, a question lingering in the air. Would his ability to be impartial, his capacity to serve justice, be questioned because of this mistake? The woman who had mistaken him for a janitor was not alone in her assumptions. Even now, many in the room were struggling to reconcile their expectations with the reality of who he was. It was not just about race or his appearance, it was something deeper, more ingrained in the way people saw authority. But this judge, this man, was no stranger to judgment. He had fought for his place, not just in the courtroom, but in society. His journey had been one of resilience, of pushing back against preconceived notions and rising above stereotypes that had followed him all his life. What would happen next would not only shock the woman who had made the mistake but also challenge the very foundation of how we view power, respect, and the people who wield them. For some, it would be a lesson in humility; for others, it would be a reminder of the biases that still run deep in the system. But for the judge, it was just another day in a life filled with challenges that no one had ever prepared him for. As the case continued, a ripple of unease spread through the room. Something wasn't right. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the case at hand. People were still processing what had just happened. Who was this judge, really? What had he endured to get to this point? And most importantly, how would this moment, the moment when he was mistaken for someone of lesser importance, affect the outcome of the trial? The woman who had made the mistake couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and curiosity. She sat there, watching him, trying to understand the complex layers of a man who had so quickly dispelled her assumptions. Every time he spoke, every time his calm gaze swept across the room, she saw someone far more powerful than she had first thought. But there was more to this story, so much more that no one in the room knew yet. The truth was, this moment was only the beginning. There was more to this judge's story than anyone could have imagined. His past, the struggles he had faced, and the moments that had shaped him into the man he was now were all a part of the puzzle. But one thing was certain, no one would ever look at him the same way again. And for some, that change would be difficult to accept. What happened next would change the course of the case, and perhaps the lives of everyone involved. But that's a story for another time. Stay tuned, because the shockwave of this moment was only the beginning. The courtroom was still heavy with the tension of the judge's unexpected arrival. The case had barely begun, but there was already an air of uncertainty among the people present. Some looked at the man in the black robe with a mix of disbelief and curiosity, while others tried to hide their unease behind polite expressions. No one spoke of it openly, but the confusion about his appearance hung like an invisible cloud over the proceedings. The woman who had mistaken him for a janitor remained in her seat, her eyes glued to the judge. She tried to focus on the case at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment of realization. She had been so sure, so certain of what she saw. But now, the man before her didn't look like the figure she had expected. He didn't look like the polished, confident authority that so often commanded respect in such settings. Yet there was something undeniably strong about him, something that made it clear that he wasn't someone to be underestimated. It wasn't just his calm demeanor that held the room's attention. It was the way he carried himself, the subtle confidence that seeped into every word he spoke. As he called the next witness, his voice was steady and authoritative. There was no doubt that he had a powerful presence, despite his unassuming appearance. He had a way of making even the smallest details feel significant, as though everything mattered. Outside the courtroom, people were beginning to hear rumors about the judge. Whispers spread like wildfire, some of them fueled by curiosity, others by disbelief. It was easy for people to make assumptions, to judge based on appearances. The fact that he had been mistaken for a janitor didn't seem to surprise anyone who had heard the stories of his past. They knew about the struggles he had faced, about the many obstacles he had overcome to get to where he was now. But what many didn't know was that the judge's journey had been far from easy. Born into a world where doors were often closed to people like him, he had spent his early years fighting for recognition. There was a time when people didn't believe he had the intellect, the drive, or the right to become the person he was today. He had come from humble beginnings, where success was a distant dream, something that seemed unattainable for someone like him. The odds had always been stacked against him. He had grown up in a neighborhood where crime was rampant, where opportunity was scarce, and where dreams often remained just that, dreams. But even in those dark days, he had never given up. He worked tirelessly, studied late into the night, and pushed through every challenge with a resilience that few could match. As he made his way through school, there were many who doubted him. Teachers, classmates, even family members, many didn't believe he had what it took to succeed. But he ignored their doubts, keeping his focus on the one thing that mattered, proving them wrong. It wasn't about making them see his potential. It was about showing the world that he was capable of achieving greatness, despite the limitations they placed on him. He had always been driven by a desire to make a difference. He didn't just want to succeed for himself, he wanted to change the system, to show others that people like him had just as much right to succeed as anyone else. He knew that in a world where people were judged by their appearance, their race, or their background, the fight for equality was never going to be easy. But he was ready for it. As he moved through his career, he faced one challenge after another. Every time he thought he had made a breakthrough, something came along to set him back. But he never gave up. Each setback only made him more determined, more resolved to break through the barriers that others had placed in his way. And now, here he was sitting at the bench in a courtroom, holding the power to make decisions that could change lives. But the truth was, the road to this moment had been anything but straightforward. Still, the whispers and rumors about his past persisted. There were always people who wanted to see him fail, people who couldn't accept that someone like him could rise to such heights. His success didn't fit the narrative they had constructed in their minds, the one where people like him were supposed to remain invisible, unnoticed, relegated to the background. But he refused to be anything less than what he had become. Inside the courtroom, the case proceeded as planned, but the discomfort lingered. People couldn't stop thinking about the moment when the judge had been mistaken for a janitor. It wasn't just the woman who had made the mistake, many others in the room had silently wondered if they, too, might have made the same assumption had they been in her shoes. They didn't want to admit it, but they couldn't help themselves. The judge's presence was undeniable, but it wasn't like anything they had expected. The tension was palpable, and as the case dragged on, it became increasingly clear that something was off. The judge was calm, composed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested there was more going on than anyone knew. His decisions were deliberate, calculated, and as the trial progressed, it became evident that this was no ordinary judge. He wasn't just here to make judgments based on the law, he was here to make a statement. Outside the courtroom, the media began to take an interest. They had caught wind of the story of the judge who had been mistaken for a janitor, and they were eager to cover it. But the more they dug into his past, the more they found. There were stories about his upbringing, his struggles, and the way he had defied expectations at every turn. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized that there were still many unanswered questions. Who was this man, really? What had shaped him into the person he was today? What were the forces that had driven him to achieve so much, despite the many obstacles that had been placed in his way? It wasn't just the media who were curious. As the trial continued, even the attorneys involved began to wonder about the judge's motivations. Why had he let the woman mistake him for a janitor? Why hadn't he corrected her immediately? Was it a deliberate move, a test to see how people would react to him? Or was it something deeper, something that only he truly understood? The suspense in the courtroom continued to build. With each passing day, the case grew more complex, and the mystery surrounding the judge deepened. People were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about him. Was he really the man they had assumed him to be? Or was there something more beneath the surface, something they hadn't yet uncovered? And then, just as the trial reached its most critical point, a new piece of information emerged, one that would change everything. The courtroom doors suddenly swung open, and a figure stepped inside. A figure who was familiar to many but who had not been seen in years. A figure who, for reasons unknown, had a vested interest in this case. The judge's face remained impassive as the new arrival approached. But those who knew him could sense that something had shifted. What would happen next? How would this new development affect the case? And more importantly, what did it mean for the judge's own journey, the journey that had led him here, to this very moment, where everything he had worked for could unravel in the blink of an eye? The figure who had just entered the courtroom was a man no one had expected to see. His presence seemed to fill the room, not in an imposing way, but in a way that made everyone take notice. He wasn't wearing the uniform of a lawyer or a law enforcement officer. Instead, he wore a plain suit, his expression unreadable. He was older, his face weathered by years of experience in the legal system, yet there was something unmistakably familiar about him, something that made everyone pause. The judge's eyes locked onto the newcomer, but he didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained unchanged, even as the tension in the room thickened. The people who had been whispering about the judge's past grew quiet. They sensed that something was about to unfold that none of them had anticipated. The woman who had mistakenly addressed the judge as a janitor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing. Who was this man? And why was he here? The newcomer didn't make a dramatic entrance. He didn't try to command attention, but his presence was undeniable. He walked to the back of the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and the room seemed to hold its breath. It was a silent exchange, but one that spoke volumes. Then, without a word, the newcomer moved to the defense table and sat down. He was a former colleague of the judge, someone with whom he had worked on many cases over the years. But there was something unsettling about his return. The judge had never spoken much about him, and no one seemed to know the full extent of their history together. Some whispered that they had once been close. Others claimed that their relationship had soured. But now, here he was, sitting in a courtroom that was becoming more and more complicated with each passing moment. The judge's face remained stoic, but internally, a wave of unease washed over him. He had expected many things to happen during this trial, but he hadn't anticipated this. The newcomer's arrival had shaken something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. The memories of their past, their shared history, the struggles, the betrayals came rushing back. He had worked hard to leave those days behind, but it seemed that fate had other plans. The tension was palpable, and as the trial continued, the judge couldn't help but notice how the dynamics in the room had shifted. The attorneys, who had once been focused solely on the case, now seemed distracted. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what this new presence meant for the proceedings. The witnesses, too, seemed unsettled. Every time the judge spoke, they looked at him with more scrutiny, more uncertainty. The case itself had been straightforward at first, a legal dispute over property ownership. But now, as the judge weighed every decision with increasing deliberation, it became clear that the trial was about more than just the matter at hand. The weight of the past, of all the unresolved tensions, was beginning to seep into the courtroom. And with the newcomer's arrival, the judge knew that the stakes had just been raised. Back in the gallery, the woman who had initially mistaken the judge for a janitor couldn't stop thinking about the strange turn of events. She had been quick to judge him based on his appearance, but now, as she watched him interact with the newcomer, she began to see a different side of him. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed when the man entered, the flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, something that suggested that their relationship was far from ordinary. Her curiosity grew with each passing moment. She had come into the courtroom expecting to witness a simple trial, but now, she felt like she was caught in the middle of something much larger. She could sense that the judge was hiding something about his past, something about the newcomer, something that no one in the room fully understood. She wasn't the only one with questions. The attorneys, too, began to take note of the subtle changes in the atmosphere. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they felt it, a shift in the power dynamics, a growing sense that something was brewing just beneath the surface. It was as if the case had become a backdrop to something much more personal, something that had little to do with the law and everything to do with the judge's history. As the trial continued, the judge's mind wandered back to that fateful day when he had first crossed paths with the newcomer. It had been years ago, but the memory was still vivid. The two of them had been part of a team working on a high-profile case, one that had captured the attention of the entire legal community. They had been close, perhaps too close, sharing their successes and their frustrations, their victories and their losses. But something had happened, something that had torn them apart. What had started as a partnership of equals had slowly eroded into something darker, something that neither of them had been prepared for. The details of that time were murky, blurred by time and the passage of events. But the one thing the judge couldn't deny was that the newcomer had betrayed him. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but the resentment still lingered. He had never forgiven him, and now, here he was again, sitting in the same courtroom. It was almost as if fate had brought them together once more, but this time, the judge wasn't sure he was ready to face the past. The newcomer, for his part, seemed unfazed by the tension he had stirred. He sat calmly at the defense table, occasionally glancing at the judge, his face unreadable. He wasn't here by accident. He had come for a reason, and it wasn't just to watch the trial unfold. No, he had a purpose, and the judge knew it. He could feel it in his bones. The question was, what was he waiting for? What did he want from the judge? And then there was the trial itself. With every new piece of evidence, every new witness, the case seemed to take on a life of its own. The judge had always prided himself on his ability to remain impartial, to separate his personal feelings from the law. But as the trial wore on, it became increasingly difficult. Every decision he made felt weighted, as though the outcome would somehow be shaped by forces beyond his control. The woman who had mistaken him for a janitor couldn't help but notice how the judge's decisions seemed to grow more deliberate, more introspective. It was as if he were weighing every word, every action, against something she couldn't see. She wanted to ask him about it, to understand what was going on behind that calm exterior, but she knew better than to do so. There was something about him that made her hesitate. Something about the way he held himself, something about the way he didn't quite fit into the expectations she had of someone in his position. The courtroom grew colder as the trial entered its final phase, and the judge's internal struggle intensified. He had fought so hard to get to this point, to be taken seriously, to prove that he was more than just a man defined by the color of his skin or the clothes he wore. But now, with the newcomer's arrival, everything felt fragile. The past was creeping in, threatening to shatter the delicate balance he had worked so hard to create. And just when it seemed that the trial might finally come to an end, the newcomer stood up. Without a word, he approached the bench, his eyes never leaving the judge's. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension so thick that it felt like it might suffocate them all. What would happen next? Would the judge finally confront the past he had buried for so long, or would he continue to hold on to the facade he had built? And would the newcomer's presence change the course of the trial, or was it all part of a much larger game that no one yet understood? The story was far from over. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the man slowly made his way to the front, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors like the ticking of an invisible clock. Every pair of eyes in the room followed him, the weight of their collective gaze pressing on his back. The judge remained seated, his hands resting on the bench, though his fingers were tense, gripping the edges as if bracing for something he couldn't control. The newcomer stopped just a few feet from the judge's elevated position, standing with a calm that only seemed to heighten the unease in the room. No one spoke. Even the air felt thick, charged with an unspoken anticipation. The audience, the attorneys, the witnesses, they were all waiting for something. What would happen next? What did the newcomer want? And why had he come back after all these years? The answers hung in the balance, but no one dared to ask the questions aloud. The judge's eyes narrowed, his thoughts racing. This was not how he had imagined today would go. The trial, once a simple matter of legal procedure, now felt like a trap, a game with rules no one understood. He had fought to get where he was, to prove that he deserved to be here, in control, in charge. But the newcomer's presence seemed to unravel everything. Each look from him reminded the judge of everything he had worked so hard to bury. In the silence, the judge's mind wandered back again to that fateful moment in their shared past, that turning point when everything had changed. The courtroom had once been a place where they stood side by side, two professionals working toward the same goal. They had both been idealistic then, believing that they could change the world through their work. But somewhere along the way, something had broken. A choice had been made, and the fracture between them had widened into a chasm neither could cross. The betrayal, the lies, the things left unsaid, it was all coming back to haunt him now. The newcomer's voice broke through the stillness, a calm, measured tone that felt at odds with the tension in the room. "I think it's time we talk, don't you?" he said, his words directed toward the judge. The judge's eyes flickered with a flash of something: anger, confusion, maybe even fear, but he said nothing. He was silent, his posture rigid, as if he were waiting for something. Or perhaps, hoping for it to never come. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge could feel the heavy weight of expectation. Everyone was waiting, unsure whether this moment would bring them closer to the truth or shatter it completely. The attorneys exchanged glances, their uncertainty evident in their furrowed brows. What had just happened? What was going on between these two men? The trial was supposed to be the focus, but now it was clear that something much larger was at play. The case, the dispute, it seemed almost secondary. It was as if they were all just pieces in a much bigger puzzle, one that none of them could see but all of them could feel. The newcomer took another step forward, his gaze never leaving the judge. "You can't keep running from this, you know," he continued, his words soft but pointed. "You've hidden from it long enough. But now it's time to face it. For both of us." The judge's jaw tightened, but he still said nothing. His mind raced, filled with a torrent of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The anger, the resentment, the regret, they all surged to the surface. This was the moment he had dreaded. The moment when everything he had worked for, everything he had become, could crumble in an instant. The gallery was still silent, but there were whispers in the air. Some speculated that the judge's past was now catching up with him, that the man standing before him held the key to some dark secret. Others wondered if this was all a calculated maneuver to derail the trial. But no one knew for sure, and that was what made the moment so unbearable. As the newcomer stood there, waiting for a response that seemed to take forever, the judge's mind was a battlefield. Every instinct told him to stand firm, to deny everything. He had worked too hard, fought too long to let this man destroy everything he had built. But the deeper truth, the part of him that couldn't be ignored, knew that this wasn't just about his career. It was about his soul, about the choices he had made, and the man who had once been his partner, his equal, who had been left behind in the process. For the first time in years, the judge felt vulnerable. It was a feeling he had long ago shut away, locked deep within himself, too dangerous to confront. But now it was there, right in front of him. The newcomer had cracked open a door he had spent so much time and energy sealing shut. And he wasn't sure he could close it again. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone could sense the shift, the quiet before the storm. They were all witnesses to something much bigger than just a legal case. The past had come back, not just to haunt the judge, but to rewrite the very narrative of who he was. Just as it seemed the judge might finally respond, the newcomer stepped closer. His voice dropped, low enough that only the judge could hear. "You can keep pretending. You can keep wearing that mask of yours, hiding behind your title and your courtroom. But I know who you really are. I know what you did." The words cut through the judge like a blade. His heart pounded in his chest. The gallery might not hear those words, but the weight of them crashed down on him with such force that it felt like the entire room was closing in. For a brief moment, the judge almost wished he could flee. But that was no longer an option. The past had caught up with him, and there was no running from it. The newcomer was right. The judge couldn't keep pretending anymore. The truth was waiting, and it was time for him to face it. But would he be able to? Would he stand firm in his position, or would the floodgates open and everything come spilling out? As the judge sat in silence, struggling with the weight of the moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable, and the audience, attorneys, and witnesses all waited for what would happen next. The clock ticked, and the feeling of inevitability grew. The judge's response or lack of it would change everything. But how much of himself was he willing to reveal? And what would happen once he did? The answers remained elusive, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Just as the room seemed to reach a boiling point, the door at the back of the courtroom suddenly creaked open, and the sound cut through the silence like a knife. Heads turned, and the newcomer took a subtle step back, his gaze flickering toward the disturbance. A figure entered, tall and commanding, yet somehow out of place. It was a woman dressed in a sharp suit, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking on the floor with every step, each one amplifying the tension in room. The judge's eyes widened imperceptibly. He knew her. Or rather, he had known her. She was a former colleague, someone he hadn't seen in years, not since the case that had driven such a deep wedge between them all. Her unexpected arrival, in the midst of everything else, was the last thing he'd expected. It was as if the universe was conspiring to force him to confront every single part of his past that he had buried so carefully. The woman's eyes scanned the room briefly, her gaze briefly landing on the judge. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then she turned her attention to the newcomer. No words were exchanged, but there was something in the way they looked at each other. It was an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement that somehow made the tension even thicker. The audience, unsure of what was happening, could only watch in stunned silence as the new player on the stage seemed to shift the entire dynamic. The judge's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected her to be here, not now. Not in the middle of this mess. He had hoped that she, like so many others, would fade into the background of his past. But here she was, standing in front of him, reminding him of the very reasons he had become who he was. The very choices he had made to leave behind everything else, everything that had once been important to him. She spoke then, her voice low but carrying. "It's been a long time," she said, her gaze now fully fixed on the judge, as if no one else in the room mattered. "We need to talk. All of us. It's time." The words landed like a bomb. The judge's eyes flickered toward the newcomer, the man who had disrupted everything with his return. Was this part of his plan? Had he brought her here? Or had she come of her own accord, for reasons even the judge didn't yet understand? The ambiguity of the situation sent a chill through him. It was as though the world had shifted on its axis, and now everything was unbalanced. The newcomer, however, didn't seem fazed. His eyes locked with hers, and for a split second, there was something almost predatory in his expression. It was as though he knew something no one else did, as if the arrival of this woman was just the next step in whatever twisted game he had set in motion. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating, and no one dared move. The judge's mind was racing. What did she want? Why had she come here now of all times? What did she know? The questions swirled like a storm in his head, each one more pressing than the last. His hands tightened on the bench again, a deep sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. But the woman wasn't finished. She stepped forward, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth as she addressed the court. The truth about what happened all those years ago. It's time it came out. Every last detail. You can't hide it anymore. The room went deathly quiet. The judge's heart skipped a beat. The truth? What truth? He felt his throat tighten, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. He had thought the past was buried, forgotten by everyone except those who lived through it. But clearly, he had been wrong. The newcomer's smile widened. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes gleamed with something darker now. He knew what was coming. He knew all along. The judge wanted to lash out, to silence them both, but something held him back. Something told him that whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. His reputation, his career, his very identity was hanging by a thread. The woman's eyes never left the judge as she continued. You don't get to rewrite history, not this time. You don't get to pretend that your actions didn't have consequences. The world is finally going to see you for who you really are. No more hiding. There it was again, the truth. What did she know? What was it that could unravel everything? The judge's palms were slick with sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The air seemed to thicken, and for the first time, the judge wondered if he could stay in control of this situation. Could he weather the storm that was coming? Or had the storm already broken, and he just hadn't realized it yet? The newcomer glanced at the woman and then back at the judge, his expression unreadable. She's right. It's time to face the music, he said, his voice cold, final. You can't run anymore. You can't hide behind your title or your courtroom. The truth is here, and it's not going away. The judge's mouth went dry. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was personal. The truth, whatever it was about to come crashing into his carefully constructed world. It felt like a dark tide was rising, and he was helpless to stop it. All of his efforts, his struggles to stay above it all, were about to be washed away in a single moment. And just like that, the door to the courtroom slammed open once again, this time with enough force to rattle the walls. Another figure stepped in, a man dressed in plain clothes but with an air of authority that immediately captured the attention of everyone present. His gaze swept the room, and the judge froze. Not him. It couldn't be. The newcomer's grin faltered, but the woman only raised an eyebrow. It seemed that even they hadn't expected this new arrival. The judge's breath caught in his throat, his heart nearly stopping in that instant. What was happening? Who was this person? And why was he here now? With that final twist, the stakes had escalated to a level the judge couldn't have imagined. His life, his career, his future, everything was now teetering on the edge of a precipice. How much longer could he stay standing before everything came crashing down? The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. And for the judge, every moment felt like a countdown. The figure who had just entered the courtroom stepped forward, his presence undeniable. He was not someone anyone had expected, least of all the judge. It was a man the judge had once known intimately, someone who had vanished years ago, someone who had disappeared under strange circumstances, leaving only rumors behind. The room fell into a stunned silence, every eye fixed on the new arrival. The judge's heart raced as his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. How could it be him? The thought echoed over and over in his head. The man had been presumed dead, buried in a past that had long since been buried under layers of lies and secrecy. Yet here he was, standing in the very courtroom where the judge had so carefully constructed his life. Did you really think you could bury the truth forever? The man's voice rang out, calm but with a steel edge. It cut through the silence like a knife. You can't escape what's already happened. The past will always catch up with you. The judge felt his knees weaken. The words hit him like a tidal wave. The past. This was at the moment he had feared. He had done everything to suppress what had happened years ago, to sweep it under the rug, to lock it away in a place where no one could find it. But now, here it was, staring him in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. The woman, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. You weren't the only one who thought you could control everything, were you? Her voice was cold, sharp. But you were wrong. All of us were wrong. The judge's head spun as fragments of memories, long buried, began to resurface. Faces, places, conversations, everything he had tried to forget came rushing back in vivid detail. The decisions, the compromises, the lies. And now, this man, the one person who knew everything, had come back to expose it all. You didn't just leave people behind, the man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. You destroyed lives. And now it's time for you to face the consequences. The weight of his words crashed down on the judge. This was no longer about him trying to maintain his position or his reputation. This was about accountability, about facing the music for all the damage he had caused. The woman's eyes met his, her expression hard. We've been watching you. All these years, hiding behind your title. Hiding behind the system. But you can't hide from us. Not anymore. The judge's mind was racing, scrambling to find an escape, to regain control of the situation, but he was trapped. The pieces of the puzzle that had been scattered for so long were finally falling into place, and he had no choice but to face the truth of his actions. For a moment, the room held its breath. The judge stood frozen, unable to speak, the weight of his past bearing down on him. The newcomer, this man who had been thought to be lost forever, had returned to upend everything, to hold him accountable. And the woman, too, had her own role in this. They were both here for one reason, to ensure the judge could no longer avoid the truth. But then, just as the judge felt he was about to crumble under the pressure, the door opened again, and a new figure stepped into the courtroom. This time, it was someone the judge never expected to see, a person who had been working behind the scenes, quietly orchestrating this entire revelation. The last thing the judge expected was to see the very person who had been his ally for so many years now standing on the other side. I've known everything, the person said, their voice cold and calculated. And I've been the one pulling the strings all along. The judge's heart skipped a beat. What? This was the final blow. The person who had been working with him, the one he had trusted more than anyone, had been the one to set this whole thing in motion. The room shifted as everyone turned to look at the new arrival, their shock mirrored in the judge's own expression. Your life is about to change forever, the person continued, a slight smile tugging at the corner of their lips. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. The judge's mind reeled. How could this be happening? Everything was collapsing around him, faster than he could process. He had never imagined this turn of events, never anticipated that someone so close to him would betray him in such a way. And then, in the silence that followed, everything became clear. This wasn't just about one man's past. It was about a system, a network of people who had manipulated and used each other for years, each one contributing to the web of lies that had ensnared everyone involved. The woman, the man, and now this new figure, they were all players in the same game, each one holding a piece of the puzzle. The judge had always believed he was in control, that he had been the one making the decisions. But now, as he stood at the center of the storm, he realized he was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game, a game that had been set in motion long before he had ever thought to question his choices. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for what would come next. The judge's thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear. How had everything gone so wrong? And who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? As the tension in the room grew unbearable, the final twist hit like a thunderclap. The woman, the one who had seemed so sure of herself, turned to the newcomer and gave him a subtle nod. And then, just as everyone thought the story was about to reach its conclusion, the newcomer did the unthinkable. He turned to the judge, his gaze cold and calculating, and said simply, "It's over." The judge's knees buckled, and for the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. The game was up. The lies, the manipulation, everything he had built crumbling in an instant. As the weight of the moment sank in, he understood. It was not just his past being exposed, it was the unraveling of a system that had kept people like him in power for far too long. The truth had finally come to light. But with it came something far more dangerous, the revelation that the very system that had protected him had now betrayed him. And as the walls closed in, he realized that the true cost of his actions had only just begun to reveal itself. The judge's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the newcomer who had just shattered everything he thought he knew. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in around him as the weight of the revelation bore down. Every decision he had ever made now seemed to come back to haunt him, and for the first time, he realized how deeply entwined his life had been in a web of lies and manipulation. But even as his world crumbled, the judge couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end. There was something about the newcomer's words, the cold finality of them, that left him with an unsettling sense of dread. He thought back to the days when he had carefully curated his life, his reputation, his career, everything he held dear. But now, it all seemed so fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse at the slightest touch. The room was silent. Every person in the courtroom was watching, waiting for the next move. The judge's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, some angle he hadn't considered, some secret that could salvage his position. But there was nothing. He had no more cards to play. He turned to the woman who had confronted him earlier, the one who had been part of this intricate web all along. Her face was hard, unforgiving. She didn't need to say anything, her expression spoke volumes. The betrayal, the anger, the years of deceit that had led to this moment. The judge knew he couldn't escape it. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. And then, in a moment of clarity, the judge realized something: it was over. Not just for him, but for all of them. For everyone who had been complicit in the system, who had turned a blind eye to the suffering they had caused in pursuit of power, status, or wealth. This was the reckoning. The moment when everything came to light. The judge looked around the room at the faces of those who had witnessed his fall. Some were sympathetic, others indifferent, but all of them knew now. There was no hiding from the truth. It had a way of seeping into the cracks, exposing what people had tried to bury for so long. The truth had no mercy. And now, it had come for him. But just as the judge began to feel the full weight of his consequences, the door to the courtroom opened again. This time, it wasn't another figure from his past. It was someone he hadn't expected, someone who had been quietly watching from the shadows. A voice, steady and calm, rang out from the back of the room. "Is this how you thought it would end?" The voice asked, its tone almost contemplative. "That everything you built would just come crumbling down, and you would be left to face the music alone?" The judge's head snapped around. It was another figure, someone who had been part of his world for a long time, but who had remained silent until now. He had assumed this person was loyal, just another cog in the machine. But now, standing before him, it was clear that loyalty had always been conditional. And as the figure stepped forward, the judge could see the same cold determination in their eyes as the others. "You've always believed you were untouchable," the voice continued. "But you've forgotten one thing: the people you've trampled on are no longer willing to stay silent." The judge felt his stomach twist. This was the final blow. He had been so focused on trying to keep everything together, so consumed by the need to control his image, his position, that he had failed to see what was happening around him. The power he had wielded was crumbling. The walls had already fallen, and now, there was nothing left but the stark reality of his actions. As the figures in the room gathered around him, the judge found himself alone, surrounded by those he had once thought of as subordinates, as people he could manipulate for his own gain. But now, they were the ones in control. They were the ones who had taken back the power that had been stolen from them. "Your reign is over," one of them said, and there was no doubt in their voice. "You've hurt too many people. You've taken too much." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was nothing left to say. No excuses, no justifications, no explanations. The reality of what he had done had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. His legacy, his carefully crafted image, everything he had worked so hard for, was now reduced to dust. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as the judge thought it couldn't get worse, the final twist came. The woman who had confronted him earlier, the one who had been so steadfast in her determination to bring him down, stepped forward once again. "I know what you did," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of pain. "But more than that, I know what you didn't do." The judge's eyes widened. "What?" He had expected her to gloat, to savor the moment of his downfall. But instead, there was something else in her expression, something deeper, more personal. She wasn't here just for revenge. She was here for justice. For the people who had been hurt by the judge's actions, for those whose lives had been destroyed by the very system he had helped build. "I'm not just here to take you down," she continued. "I'm here to make sure this never happens again. We're going to fix what you broke." The judge swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of her words was more than he could bear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something larger, something that had to be repaired, rebuilt from the ground up. The system he had helped create had been flawed from the start. And now, it was up to those who had suffered the most to fix it. As the figures in the courtroom began to leave, the judge was left standing alone, the echo of their footsteps fading into the distance. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the reality of his choices. And while he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, he knew that the world around him was changing. People were no longer willing to be silent. They were no longer willing to let injustice reign unchecked. The judge had thought he was in control. He had believed that power was something that could be held, that it could be manipulated, molded to his will. But now, as he stood in the aftermath of everything he had lost, he understood that true power wasn't about control. It wasn't about status or reputation. It was about accountability. It was about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And though the road ahead was uncertain, and the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life, the judge couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. It was a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was finally starting to shift. That the people who had been pushed aside, forgotten, and mistreated could finally have their voices heard. The judge walked out of the courtroom for the last time, his head held low. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The reckoning had come, and he had finally faced it.